Little Mizzlewick decided to save its hedgehogs before checking whether they needed saving. Soon there were maps, patrols, holes in fences, and a high-tech tunnel mostly used by cinders. Welcome to the Great Hedgehog Highway, a story of excellent intentions, unnecessary infrastructure, and 3 hedgehogs who would rather everyone kept the noise down.
The article that started it all. The morning mist was just lifting from Little Mizzlewick's cobbled square when Sarah Logan burst through the door of Henderson's butchery. The brass bell above the door gave an alarmed jangle, and Mr. Henderson looked up from the lamb chops he had been arranging with mathematical precision. "Emergency!" Sarah announced, waving a newspaper. Mr. Henderson, who had learned during his years of village service that Sarah's emergencies ranged from genuine crises to the discovery of particularly good scones at the bakery, set down his knife and waited. "Hedgehogs! They're disappearing! The article says Britain's lost half its hedgehogs in the last 20 years. That's a hedgehog apocalypse." "Very concerning," Mr. Henderson agreed diplomatically, though privately he wondered if anyone in Little Mizzlewick had actually seen a hedgehog recently. "We must do something," Sarah continued, her voice rising with conviction. "Little Mizzlewick cannot simply stand by while hedgehogs disappear from the British countryside. We have a duty, a responsibility, a calling." At precisely this moment, as if summoned by the very mention of a wildlife crisis, June Marsh appeared in the doorway. She carried a wicker basket that suggested she had come for her usual Friday order of mince, but her expression indicated she had overheard enough of the conversation to form opinions. "Hedgehogs," June said with the tone she usually reserved for discussing Ben Carter's more ambitious gardening experiments, "are not disappearing from Little Mizzlewick. One has been snuffling around and disturbing my borders for weeks, and a dreadful creature. Holes everywhere." Sarah spun around with the delight of someone whose cause had just received supporting evidence. "Exactly. You see, we have hedgehogs, living, breathing, snuffling hedgehogs right here in our village, which means we have the power to save them." "I was rather hoping," June said carefully, "to discourage it from my rosebeds, not encourage an entire hedgehog population to take up residence." "But that's precisely the point," Sarah exclaimed, brandishing the newspaper again. "We need to create habitat corridors, hedgehog highways, safe passage between gardens so they can do whatever it is hedgehogs need to do." Mr. Henderson cleared his throat. "What exactly do hedgehogs need to do?" Sarah looked at him with mild surprise, as though the answer should be obvious to anyone with a basic understanding of wildlife conservation. "Hedgehog things," she said confidently. "Important hedgehog activities. Foraging, mating, hibernating. The article says they need to move freely between territories." "Mine can move freely away from my borders," June muttered. But her comment was lost as the shop door opened again to admit Major Burns, who had been conducting his morning reconnaissance of the village centre. "Hedgehogs," Sarah said immediately, thrusting the newspaper toward him. "National crisis, local action required." Major Burns accepted the paper and studied it with the concentration he had once applied to matters considerably more serious. "Hedgehogs," he repeated slowly. "Spiny mammals, primarily nocturnal, covert night operators." "Exactly," Sarah beamed, though it was unclear whether the Major's interpretation aligned with her conservation concerns. "These creatures operate under cover of darkness." He looked up. "We need monitoring protocols." June raised an eyebrow that suggested she found the Major's tactical enthusiasm only marginally more sensible than Sarah's conservation fervour. "What exactly are you proposing to monitor? Whether my plants survive the night?" Before the Major could respond, the door opened once more to reveal Ben Carter, looking slightly breathless and carrying his phone and a notebook. Word of Sarah's hedgehog emergency had clearly travelled the village's invisible communication network with remarkable speed. "Right," Ben announced. I've been researching. Habitat corridors are absolutely doable. Simple modifications to existing fence structures, creating tunnel networks between properties. I can design proper passages and track usage. This could be a model project for the region. Sarah clasped her hands together. Perfect. When can you start? I'll need to survey the area first, Ben replied, consulting his notebook. Map optimal routes, identify key connection points, calculate materials requirements. Give me a week for the preliminary assessment. June looked between Sarah's enthusiasm, the Major's tactical interest, and Ben's technological optimism, with the expression of someone watching a small problem grow steadily larger. I still maintain, she said firmly, that the creature currently residing in my border is quite content with existing arrangements. Eleanor Vance chose this moment to enter the shop, drawn by the unusual congregation visible through the window. Village meeting? She inquired mildly. Hedgehog conservation, Sarah explained. National crisis, local solution. We're organising habitat corridors throughout Little Mizzlewick. Eleanor accepted this information with composed interest. How fascinating! I would be happy to maintain observation records. Documentation will be essential for assessing the project's effectiveness. Scientific approach, the Major approved. Excellent planning. Leo Turnbull appeared in the doorway carrying his usual collection of electronic equipment and wearing the expression of someone who had detected potential content. Did someone say village project? He asked hopefully, already adjusting his camera angle. Wildlife conservation could be perfect for winter material. Hedgehog watch, Little Mizzlewick edition, weekly updates, progress tracking, maybe some night vision footage. Standard observation protocols could be shared for civilian purposes, the Major said, looking rather pleased to have his equipment referenced. Mr. Henderson, who had been listening to this rapidly escalating plan, finally intervened. Perhaps we should consider what hedgehogs actually require before we redesign the entire village. This practical suggestion was met with a moment of thoughtful silence. The article, Sarah said, consulting the newspaper again, mentions habitat connectivity. Hedgehogs need to move between feeding areas, nesting sites, and other hedgehogs. Which is precisely why we need highways, Ben said, pulling up diagrams on his phone. Proper designated routes that bypass sensitive areas while maintaining habitat connectivity. Gavin Price appeared from the back of the shop where he had been waiting for his order. Do hedgehogs need planning permission? He called. Because there will be regulations. It's for conservation, Sarah declared. Try telling that to the council, Gavin replied cheerfully, and departed with his parcel before Sarah could respond. Eleanor raised her hand with the mild authority of someone accustomed to managing classroom discussions. Perhaps we should begin with research and observation before implementing major infrastructure changes. Observation protocols, the Major agreed. Intelligence gathering before operational deployment. I could start filming tonight, Leo offered. June looked around the shop, now containing approximately half the village's population, all discussing hedgehog infrastructure with increasing complexity. I suppose, she said with resignation, someone should check whether we actually have more than one hedgehog before we redesign Little Mizzlewick as a wildlife sanctuary. Excellent point, Sarah declared. We need a proper hedgehog census, count our current population, assess their needs, then design appropriate solutions. As the gathering began to disperse with the satisfied energy of people who had discovered a shared purpose, Eleanor paused beside June, who was collecting her shopping with the resigned air of someone whose peaceful Friday had been thoroughly disrupted. You know, Eleanor said, this could actually be quite interesting. When do we ever get the chance to study wildlife behaviour in our own back gardens? June considered this while checking her list. I suppose, she admitted reluctantly, it might be educational, though I still maintain that creature had better keep away from my borders. Outside, the village square was buzzing with the aftermath of spontaneous organisation. The morning mist had completely lifted. revealing a perfectly ordinary square where perfectly ordinary villagers had just committed themselves to a hedgehog highway project that none of them entirely understood. It was going to be an interesting winter. A motley crew and a grand design. By Monday morning, Little Mizzlewick had divided itself into competing hedgehog factions with the efficiency of a village that had never encountered a cause it could not complicate through enthusiastic participation. Sarah Logan had established what she called Hedgehog Highway Command at her kitchen table, armed with ordnance survey maps, wildlife guides from the library, and a stack of conservation printouts. The plan was simple: make the village passable for hedgehogs. She had already approached 6 neighbours about fence modifications, armed with photographs of successful schemes elsewhere and an infectious enthusiasm that made refusal seem almost unpatriotic. June Marsh, meanwhile, had organised what she preferred to call controlled wildlife management from her greenhouse, where she kept detailed charts of her garden's layout and a growing collection of hedgehog deterrent research. Her plan focused on directing wildlife away from sensitive areas while maintaining what she grudgingly acknowledged as reasonable habitat provision. "There is no point," she told Tom Armitage, as he helped her reinforce her rose bed borders, "in creating highways that lead directly to prize-winning flora. We need strategic barriers, not blanket access." Tom, who approached most village projects with the practical wisdom of someone who had learned that enthusiasm often required subsequent repair work, had volunteered to help with fence modifications for both factions. Diplomatic engineering, he called it privately, though he was careful not to voice this assessment to either party. Major Burns had established Operation Hedgehog from his conservatory, which he had converted into what he referred to as a tactical command centre. His approach involved night patrols, detailed observation logs, and a rotation schedule that would have impressed a military planning committee. "Intelligence gathering is paramount," he announced to Arthur at the Shepherd's Crook. "We need comprehensive data on hedgehog movement patterns, territorial preferences, and operational schedules before implementing any infrastructure changes." Arthur nodded diplomatically. "Very thorough approach, Major." "Cannot proceed without proper reconnaissance," the Major continued. "Sarah's highway concept has merit, but requires tactical positioning. June's barrier strategy shows sound defensive thinking. What we need is integrated planning." Ben Carter had taken a completely different approach, establishing what he thought of as his hedgehog infrastructure workshop in his garage, where he had begun constructing a motion-monitored tunnel system. His sensors would provide data about usage patterns. "Traditional fence holes are fine," he explained to Eleanor during an impromptu demonstration, "but they lack monitoring capabilities. My system provides real-time data about wildlife movement while ensuring optimal passage conditions." The prototype tunnel gleamed with integrated technology in a way that looked more suitable for space exploration than wildlife conservation. But Ben's enthusiasm was undeniable, and his technical specifications were impressively detailed. Eleanor had appointed herself the project's scientific observer, maintaining careful notes about each faction's approach, while declining to commit fully to any single strategy. Her role, she explained, was to document outcomes rather than influence methodology. "Fascinating social experiment," she told Lucy during their Tuesday tea. "The village has essentially divided into competing conservation philosophies within 48 hours of reading a newspaper article." "Which approach do you think will work?" Lucy asked. Eleanor considered this carefully. "I suspect," she said finally, "that the hedgehogs will prove remarkably indifferent to our planning efforts." Leo Turnbull had embraced the project with the devotion of someone who had discovered perfect content material. He was already on episode 3 of Hedgehog Watch, the village's conservation soap opera, as he privately thought of it. "This is community conservation in action," he announced. "Watch as an entire village mobilises to protect British wildlife through innovative habitat management." By Wednesday, the competing approaches had begun generating unexpected complications. Sarah's fence modification campaign had achieved mixed results. Ruth Henderson had enthusiastically agreed to hedgehog holes, resulting in neat circular openings that immediately became popular with a neighbour's terrier. One long-established gap in Graham Henderson's back fence, which had been propped with a loose board for years, was promptly adopted by Margaret Henderson's ginger cat, Barnaby, as a convenient shortcut to the bird table in the adjacent garden. June's barrier strategy had produced impressive defensive earthworks around her rose beds, but had also created what Ben described as serious drainage issues that threatened to flood the adjacent path during the next heavy rain. The Major's night patrols had yielded detailed logs of nocturnal wildlife activity, though most entries involved cats, foxes, and one confused badger. His proudest discovery had been multiple unidentified rustling incidents that might have been hedgehogs, but could equally well have been wind in the privet hedge. Ben's tunnel system had attracted considerable attention from the village children, who declared it brilliant and immediately began organising races for anything small enough to fit through the pipe. The motion sensors recorded constant activity, though analysis revealed the primary user was Cinders, who had apparently discovered that Ben's carefully engineered passage provided excellent shelter during rain showers. The station cat, Ben said when Leo broke the news. He's been in there all morning, Leo confirmed, not without sympathy. The situation reached a natural point of review on Thursday evening at the Shepherd's Crook, where the various faction leaders had gathered for what Eleanor diplomatically described as a progress review and coordination discussion. My sensors are showing constant tunnel usage, Ben announced, consulting his phone. Clear evidence of wildlife highway adoption. Because cats have discovered an interesting new toy, June replied tartly. That is not conservation, that is providing entertainment for pets. At least my approach generates measurable data, Ben countered. The Major straightened with military dignity. Proper surveillance requires comprehensive documentation, unlike fence modifications that create holes for random livestock. Livestock? Sarah's voice rose with indignation. We are talking about native wildlife conservation, not sheep farming. Arthur, who had been observing the debate from behind the bar with the expression of a man waiting for the right moment, finally intervened. Perhaps, he suggested mildly, someone should check whether we actually have hedgehogs before we continue expanding the infrastructure. This practical observation was met with a moment of startled silence. The Major has been conducting surveys, Sarah said uncertainly. Surveillance, the Major corrected, and the results remain, as yet, inconclusive. What does that mean? Eleanor asked. The Major consulted his notebook. Multiple contacts suggesting hedgehog presence, definitive visual confirmation pending. You mean you haven't actually seen one? June translated. Visual confirmation is challenging with nocturnal subjects, the Major replied. However, circumstantial evidence strongly suggests an active hedgehog population. Ben looked up from his phone, where he had been reviewing sensor data, with a slightly furrowed expression. Actually, he said slowly, most of my tunnel activity happens during daylight hours, which is odd because hedgehogs are supposed to be nocturnal. Leo, who had been filming the discussion for his latest episode, lowered his phone with a thoughtful expression. I have hours of night footage from around the village, lots of cats, some foxes, one very confused chicken that escaped from the Armitage property, but now that I think about it, no actual hedgehogs. The conservation leaders looked at each other with the dawning awareness that their elaborate planning might have overlooked a fundamental question. So where, Eleanor asked with academic precision, are Little Mizzlewick's hedgehogs? Gavin Price, who had been listening from the bar while consuming a ploughman's lunch, chose this moment to contribute. Maybe they have seen all the construction work and decided to find somewhere quieter, he suggested cheerfully. Cannot say I would blame them. All that drilling and tunnel building and fence modification probably sounds like a building site to a hedgehog. This observation was followed by a longer silence. Are you suggesting, Sarah said carefully, that our conservation efforts might have discouraged the hedgehogs we are trying to protect. I am suggesting, Gavin replied, that if I were a small, spiky creature who liked peace and quiet, I probably would not stick around while the entire neighbourhood got renovated. Arthur set down his glass and looked around the table at the assembled planners. Right, he said. Seems like we need to find our hedgehogs before we build them any more highways. The Hedgehog Conservation Project had reached its first proper crisis. All the planning, modification and technological innovation had proceeded without the fundamental step of confirming that Little Mizzlewick actually had hedgehogs to conserve. It was, Eleanor thought, a perfectly typical village project. Enthusiastic, well-intentioned, thoroughly organised and potentially addressing a problem that might not actually exist. So, what do we do now? Leo asked. The Major consulted his watch. Emergency reconnaissance mission, he announced. Full village survey. Tomorrow night. Comprehensive search and documentation. Sarah nodded with renewed determination. Village-wide hedgehog hunt. Everyone participates. Census operation, Eleanor suggested diplomatically. Controlled wildlife observation. June looked around the table with the expression of someone who had just realised she had spent 3 days building defensive earthworks against an enemy that might not exist. Fine, she said with resignation. But if we are tramping around in the dark looking for hedgehogs, someone is bringing proper torches and biscuits, and I am wearing my gardening boots. The Great Hedgehog Highway project was about to enter its next phase, actually finding the hedgehogs. The Great Night Watch. Friday evening brought crisp air, clear skies, and the peculiar sight of Little Mizzlewick's residents assembling in the village square, armed with torches and thermoses. Eleanor had organised the evening with the methodical approach she had once applied to school field trips, complete with a clipboard, a village map marked with search sectors, and safety instructions that emphasised the importance of staying within designated areas. The plan, she announced to the gathered crowd, is complete coverage of the entire village. Each team takes a sector, maintains communication through mobile phones, and documents any hedgehog sightings with location and time. Sarah carried her wildlife guides and a bag containing what appeared to be hedgehog food samples. If we encounter any, I have brought appropriate treats, she explained. Mealworms, cat food, and some apple slices. The books say hedgehogs appreciate variety. The Major had equipped himself with night vision equipment from his personal collection, a torch powerful enough to illuminate a barn at 20 paces, and a notebook already ruled into columns. Standard reconnaissance, he announced. Observe and record. Ben Carter appeared with his phone mounted on a stabilising gimbal and what looked like a portable sound recorder. If there are hedgehogs out there, he declared, my equipment will find them. Leo had arrived with multiple camera setups, including what he proudly described as professional night vision streaming equipment, borrowed from a friend who used it for security work. This could be the most comprehensive hedgehog documentation ever attempted by a British village, he announced to his growing online audience. June appeared wearing practical boots, carrying a powerful torch and expressing the resigned determination of someone who had decided that if the village was going to conduct a nocturnal wildlife hunt, it should at least be done properly. She had also brought a flask of tea, 2 slices of fruitcake wrapped in foil, and an expression that made clear these were for personal use only. Tom Armitage brought his knowledge of local geography and a thermos, which he shared with anyone whose enthusiasm had exceeded their preparation. Dr. Thorne had come along with the quiet, good sense of someone who attended village adventures, not out of curiosity, but out of professional habit, and had his bag with him just in case. Arthur had closed the pub early and joined the expedition with the air of a man who had decided that if his regulars were going to be wandering around in the dark, he might as well keep an eye on them. By 8 o'clock, the hedgehog hunters had been divided into search teams and dispatched to their respective sectors. Team 1, consisting of Sarah, Eleanor and Dr. Thorne, took the residential areas around the church. The sector was peaceful, with the old stone walls and the faint sound of the bell tower settling in the cold. Sarah, following advice from her wildlife guides, made small encouraging sounds at regular intervals that the books had described as likely to attract foraging hedgehogs. Eleanor documented the sounds of the village at night, which proved plentiful. Several cats emerged from gardens to investigate the new arrivals, decided against it, and disappeared again. No hedgehogs. Team 2, featuring the Major, Tom and Arthur, focused on compost areas and allotment edges, which the Major had identified as likely foraging ground. This took them along the outer lane past Ruth Henderson's cottage, where Brandy the spaniel became briefly very interested in Arthur through the gate. The sector yielded beetles, field mice, and one small frog, who seemed as surprised by the encounter as they were. The Major logged all of these dutifully. No hedgehogs. Team 3, comprised of Ben, Leo and June, represented the technological approach to hedgehog detection. Ben's equipment provided constant updates about movement, temperature variations and sound patterns, while Leo documented everything for his increasingly excited online audience. Motion sensor indicates activity behind the hedge, Ben announced, consulting his phone. Thermal imaging suggests mammalian presence. Leo immediately focused his camera on the indicated area, while June approached with practical directness. She stood, looked, and came back. "It is Barnaby," she said, having what appears to be a romantic encounter with someone else's cat. "Not hedgehogs," Ben confirmed, though his equipment continued registering enthusiastic activity from behind the hedge. In Team 4, consisting of Alfie Crane, Gavin and Lucy, had chosen a methodical approach focused on areas where hedgehogs might actually choose to live, rather than areas where humans expected to find them. "Hedgehogs prefer quiet spaces," Lucy observed, leading them toward the less manicured corners of the village, away from main paths, near natural cover, undisturbed areas where they can forage without interruption. Alfie, who spent more time moving quietly through the village than almost anyone, had his own thoughts on this. His rounds had given him a thorough map of where things actually happened in Little Mizzlewick, as opposed to where the village thought things happened, and these did not always coincide. He had noticed, over the past fortnight, what he was fairly sure were hedgehog tracks in the soft mud near the old stone wall behind the post office. He had not mentioned this to anyone, partly because he had not been asked, and partly because he was fairly certain the hedgehogs were managing perfectly well without assistance. "There are some decent spots down behind the church wall," he said now, almost to himself. Lucy looked at him. "Have you seen any?" Alfie considered this. "Signs of things," he said carefully, which was his way of not committing to anything he had not fully verified. This sensible approach took them through parts of Little Mizzlewick that rarely featured in village life. The spaces between cottages, the corners behind sheds, the patches of semi-wild land that existed in the gaps of human organisation. They encountered a badger who regarded them with dignified curiosity before continuing about its business. Several owls who contributed atmospheric hooting to the evening's soundtrack, and what was almost certainly a fox moving through the shadows beyond torch range. But hedgehogs, despite careful searching and appropriate habitat identification, remained elusive. By 10 o'clock, the search teams had begun encountering each other with increasing frequency. The village, it turned out, was smaller than systematic searching had suggested, and the torches had begun converging on similar areas. Ben's equipment had recorded constant activity throughout the evening, though analysis revealed most detections involved cats, dogs, and team members walking past sensor range. "Lots of data," he admitted, "but nothing specifically hedgehog-related." Leo's night vision footage had captured atmospheric shots of the village after dark, several startled cats, and one memorable sequence of the Major attempting to communicate with a confused barn owl through a series of hand signals. The owl had regarded him with the patient incomprehension of a creature that had never been briefed on human reconnaissance protocols. Great content, Leo admitted, but still no hedgehogs. Eleanor's documentation showed a thorough survey, even if a definitive result remained pending. As 11 o'clock approached, the teams reconvened at the village square with the slightly deflated air of people whose enthusiasm had exceeded their results. Thermoses were opened, biscuits distributed, and torches turned off to conserve batteries. The square was quiet around them, lamplight falling on the cobbles in that particular winter way that made the village look like something on a postcard, though none of them was in the mood to appreciate it. So, June said, with the practical directness that had made her an effective village organiser for 2 decades, either Little Mizzlewick has no hedgehogs, or they are significantly better at hiding than we expected. Perhaps they are hibernating, Sarah suggested hopefully. The article mentioned that hedgehogs sleep through winter. Maybe they are all tucked away somewhere warm and will not emerge until spring. Tom Armitage, who had been listening to the various theories while sharing his tea with anyone whose flask had run empty, finally spoke up. Or, he said with the gentle pragmatism that came from 40 years of practical problem-solving, maybe we have been looking in the wrong places. What do you mean? Leo asked, still filming despite the lack of hedgehog content. Tom considered his response carefully. Hedgehogs want quiet, safe places to sleep through winter, somewhere protected from weather and disturbance. We have been searching gardens and open areas, but maybe we should be thinking about spaces that humans do not usually visit. Like where? Sarah asked. Sheds, Tom suggested, under outbuildings, forgotten corners, places where a small creature could make a nest and not be bothered by all this excitement. The searchers looked at each other with the dawning awareness that their carefully planned village-wide hunt might have overlooked the most obvious hedgehog habitats. My garden shed, June said slowly. I have not been in there since October, if something was sleeping underneath. Arthur's storage building behind the pub, the Major contributed. Excellent defensive position, minimal foot traffic. Alfie said nothing, but he looked faintly thoughtful. As midnight approached, the hedgehog searchers faced a choice: continue the hunt into areas they had initially avoided, or accept that the evening's detailed search had provided valuable data about where hedgehogs were not. Perhaps, Eleanor suggested, we could resume with fresh searches tomorrow morning. Check the likely hibernation spots when we are not stumbling around in the dark. This practical suggestion was met with general agreement. The Great Night Watch had provided considerable data about village wildlife patterns, even if it had not achieved its primary objective. As the search teams began dispersing to their respective homes, Leo continued his documentation of the evening's events, panning slowly across the empty square. So concludes Little Mizzlewick's first village-wide hedgehog survey, he announced to his camera. Results pending, but community engagement has been absolutely fantastic. Tomorrow we will be searching potential hibernation sites to solve the mystery of our missing hedgehogs. The village square gradually emptied, leaving only the street lamps and the faint rustle of nocturnal wildlife, continuing its activities well beyond the range of anyone's torch. The Unhurried Truth. Saturday morning dawned with frost on the grass and the particular energy that follows a village adventure which has generated more questions than answers. By 9 o'clock, several hedgehog hunters were gathered in the village square, equipped with fresh determination and the practical realization that hibernating hedgehogs might require different search strategies than active ones. June Marsh arrived first, carrying her garden keys and the businesslike expression of someone who had decided to solve the mystery through direct investigation. Her shed had not been properly checked since autumn, and if hedgehogs were seeking quiet winter accommodation, her potting area qualified as reasonable real estate. Sarah Logan appeared moments later, clutching a thermos and her wildlife guides. The previous evening's search had only increased her determination to locate Little Mizzlewick's hedgehogs, and the possibility of finding them safely hibernating rather than genuinely missing had restored her conservation optimism somewhat, though she was being careful not to let it show in case it ran ahead of the evidence again. Eleanor Vance joined them with her notebook and a methodical approach. If hedgehogs were present but sleeping, proper documentation would be essential for both conservation planning and village harmony. Ben Carter had arrived with considerably reduced technological equipment and a more practical focus. His motion sensors and thermal imaging had proved excellent for detecting cats, but less useful for dormant wildlife. Today's search would rely on careful observation and less on electronic assistance. He had not entirely abandoned the sensors, but he had left the gimbal at home. The Major appeared with a powerful torch and what appeared to be a military-issue magnifying glass, which he held with the conviction of someone who had never questioned whether a magnifying glass was the right tool for the situation. Leo, ever faithful to his documentation mission, carried his camera equipment and the enthusiasm of someone whose Hedgehog Watch series had gained nearly 400 subscribers overnight. Morning search protocols, he announced to his audience, focus on likely winter shelter locations. Arthur had volunteered his storage areas for investigation, partly from civic responsibility and partly from genuine curiosity about what might be living behind his pub. Tom Armitage brought practical tools and a calm competence that had proved repeatedly useful during the Hedgehog project, particularly during June's drainage crisis. The first search target was June's garden shed. June unlocked the door with ceremonial precision while they gathered behind her. Morning light entered ahead of them, catching the organised chaos of a gardener's winter storage. Pots stacked with precision, tools arranged by season, compost bags lined up, hose wound neatly in a coil. "Very tidy," Eleanor observed approvingly. Ben crouched near the back corner, where shadows gathered naturally behind the largest plant pots. "Good visibility here," he reported. "Space for... wait." His voice carried the sudden attention of someone who had spotted something significant. "What is it?" Sarah asked. Ben pointed toward a neat hollow behind 3 large terracotta pots, where dried leaves had been arranged into what was unmistakably a purposeful nest. The construction showed clear signs of occupation. Leaves pressed into comfortable sleeping arrangements, a small scattering of beetle shells indicating regular meals, and the sort of tidy organisation that suggested long-term residence. "Hedgehog nest," Eleanor confirmed, consulting her wildlife guide. Typical winter construction, leaves for insulation, protected location, evidence of foraging activity. "But where is the hedgehog?" Leo asked, focusing his camera on the empty nest, with a slightly deflated expression. June examined the construction with the analytical attention she usually applied to her rose beds. "Recent activity," she observed. "These leaves have been rearranged within the last day or two. Whatever was living here has moved on." The discovery of clear hedgehog evidence without an actual hedgehog created a new puzzle. Little Mizzlewick definitely had hedgehogs, but they appeared to be remarkably skilled at not being there when people arrived. "Perhaps," the Major suggested, "our reconnaissance activities last night disturbed their operational security, temporary relocation to alternative safe houses." Sarah looked stricken. "You mean our search might have frightened them away?" Tom offered a more optimistic interpretation. "Or they just shifted to a different spot for the day. Hedgehogs are not entirely dormant during hibernation. They wake up periodically, move around, find new sleeping spots." This possibility restored some hope to the search party, though it raised the further question of where a displaced hedgehog might relocate at short notice in a village that had spent the past week conducting extensive noise works on its behalf. The search party moved through other outbuildings around the village, finding further empty nests and clear evidence of recent hedgehog activity, but no actual creatures. By 11 o'clock, they had discovered signs of at least 3 different hedgehogs without encountering a single one. "This is becoming ridiculous," June announced, with the frustration of someone whose practical nature was being tested by creatures who declined to cooperate with human scheduling. We know they are here. We can see where they have been living. Why can we not find them? It was at this moment, as the search party stood in the village square debating their next strategy, that Nora Field appeared from the direction of her cottage, carrying her canvas bag and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had solved a problem through simple observation rather than elaborate organisation. "Looking for hedgehogs?" she asked mildly. Sarah spun around with renewed hope. "Have you seen them? Do you know where they are?" Nora set down her bag and regarded the searchers with gentle amusement. "They are under my potting shed," she said matter-of-factly. "All three of them. Have been since November. Lovely little family, curled up together for the winter." The announcement was met with stunned silence. "Under your shed?" Eleanor repeated carefully. "Beneath the floor," Nora confirmed. "Found them back in autumn when I was storing the summer pots. Did not seem right to disturb them, so I left them be. They have been sleeping there quite peacefully ever since." June stared at Nora with the expression of someone whose elaborate conservation planning had just been rendered unnecessary by neighbourly common sense. "You mean you have known where they were the entire time?" "Of course," Nora replied, as though this should have been obvious. Seemed better to let them sleep than make a fuss. Ben looked at his collection of sensors and monitoring equipment with the dawning realization that the most sophisticated detection system in Little Mizzlewick had been defeated by a neighbour who had simply noticed where the hedgehogs had chosen to live and had then left them to get on with it. Leo lowered his camera. He was, for one of the few times in his life, genuinely speechless. Within a few moments he had recovered and was already framing the anticlimactic revelation into something his audience might appreciate, but for those few seconds the silence was complete. Sarah experienced the complex emotions of someone whose passionate conservation efforts had proved both unnecessary and entirely beside the point. "So they have been safe all along?" "Very safe," Nora confirmed cheerfully. "Warm, dry, undisturbed, exactly what hibernating hedgehogs need. Though I did notice all the excitement last night. Thought you might be looking for them." Eleanor approached this revelation with academic interest. "Why did you not mention this earlier, during all our planning and searching?" Nora considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Seemed like you were all enjoying yourselves," she said. "The organising and the equipment and the committee meetings. I did not want to spoil it before it had run its course." Arthur began to chuckle, low and genuine. "So while we have been building highways and conducting night patrols and designing tunnel systems, the hedgehogs have been sleeping peacefully under Nora's shed." "Getting excellent rest, I should think," Nora agreed. "Away from all the construction noise." The Conservation Committee looked at each other with varying degrees of chagrin, amusement, and relief. Their elaborate planning had addressed a problem that did not exist, while the actual hedgehogs had been quietly managing their own accommodation needs without any human assistance whatsoever. "Well," Sarah said finally, her conservation enthusiasm adapting gradually to the new reality, "at least we know they are healthy and safe." "Very healthy," Nora confirmed. "I have been keeping an eye on them without being intrusive. They have plenty of natural food sources, good shelter, and no disturbances. Perfect hedgehog habitat." June experienced the particular private satisfaction of someone whose initial instincts had been proved correct by events, even if the events had taken a slightly unexpected route to get there. "I suppose this means we can stop modifying everyone's fences." "Probably sensible," Tom agreed. "Though the holes already made will give cats some interesting new travel options." Ben looked at his tunnel system with the mixed emotions of an engineer whose sophisticated solution had been rendered obsolete by simpler alternatives. The motion sensors did at least prove that cats appreciate good infrastructure. Eleanor made a final note in her record of the morning's revelations. "Valuable lesson in conservation methodology," she observed. "Sometimes the best protection is simply leaving things alone." "Should we go and see them?" Sarah asked hopefully. Just a quick look to confirm they are really there. Nora shook her head, firmly but without unkindness. Better not to disturb them. They will emerge when spring comes, and they are ready. Until then, they are exactly where they want to be. The Hedgehog Conservation Committee began to disperse, their mission accomplished through the peculiar discovery that it had never been necessary in the first place. The village's hedgehogs were safe, healthy, and properly housed without any assistance from highway construction or tunnel engineering. As the group walked back toward the village square, June paused beside Nora. "How did you know not to interfere?" she asked. "Most people would have wanted to help somehow." Nora considered this, spent enough years watching things grow. She said finally, "Sometimes the best gardening is knowing when to leave well enough alone. Hedgehogs have been managing winter accommodation for considerably longer than humans have been offering advice about it." Under Nora's potting shed, 3 hedgehogs continued their peaceful hibernation, blissfully unaware of all the excitement they had generated. Spring would come eventually, and when it did, they would emerge to find a village that had learned something modest and useful about the difference between helping and interfering. The hedgehog highways remained in place, providing excellent travel routes for cats and the occasional confused chicken. The night patrol equipment was returned to storage, where it awaited the next village mystery requiring systematic investigation. Eleanor reflected, as she walked home through the cold morning, that it was a perfectly satisfactory end to a perfectly typical village adventure. The village had saved its hedgehogs by discovering they had never needed saving at all.
Once the hedgehogs were found, several villagers claimed they had known all along. Naturally. Thank you for listening, and do tell me in the comments who you think enjoyed the whole business most. A Little Mizzlewick story from Once Otherwhere, where small stories have big hearts.